It seems like everywhere you turn these days, you hear the term trade war.
Yeah, you're right. It's everywhere.
And it sounds kind of scary, right? Like some sort of economic clash of the titans. But what's the reality of it? Like beyond the headlines, what does the trade war actually mean, particularly for a country like India?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it? We've been looking at some really interesting research, including some that focuses specifically on India and the global trade situation, and it's all updated to March 2025, so it's really current.
Oh, wow. So hot off the presses.
Yeah, exactly. And what we want to do today is try to break down this complex topic so we can really understand what's going on with these trade wars, what kind of impact they have, and how India is positioned in this whole global mess.
Yeah, sounds good. So let's jump right into it. When we talk about a trade war, what exactly is happening? Like, what are the first moves in this economic battle?
Well, the basic starting point is usually tariffs. Countries start putting tariffs on each other's imports, and a tariff is basically like a tax on goods coming in from another country.
Oh, okay. So it's like saying we want people to buy things made here, not from somewhere else. So we're going to make the imported stuff more expensive.
Exactly. It's a way to protect domestic industries from competition, make it harder for foreign goods to compete.
Makes sense. But I imagine it rarely ends there, right? It kind of kicks off a whole chain reaction, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's this almost automatic retaliation. When one country hits another with a tariff, the other one almost always hits back with their own tariffs on the first country's exports. So it becomes this back and forth escalation, a tit for tat, where each new tariff leads to another one, and pretty soon it disrupts the whole flow of global trade.
So it's like an argument that spins out of control,
Right.
right? Like, let's say one country puts a tariff on imported steel. The other might retaliate by taxing exported cars. Then maybe electronics get hit, and then agricultural products, and everyone ends up paying more and selling less.
That's a great analogy. It really captures the dynamic. You end up with this interconnected web of tariffs where everything gets more expensive for everyone, and that hurts both businesses and consumers in the long run.
Okay, so we see how this back and forth works and how it can escalate. But what are the real-world consequences of these trade wars? What kind of damage do they do to the global economy?
Well, the research we've been looking at outlines some pretty serious negative
No, let's
consequences.
hear them.
First off, as we already touched on, there's the issue of higher prices for goods. When tariffs make imported components or finished products more expensive, those costs are usually passed down to the consumer right at the checkout counter.
Right, so it hits people's wallets directly.
Exactly. And it's not just when the tariffs actually go into effect. Even the threat of tariffs can cause problems. One of the reports we were looking at, an industry analysis from early 2025, actually found that just the announcement of potential tariffs can lead to price swings as businesses start anticipating higher costs.
So the uncertainty itself can be destabilizing.
Yeah, it creates a lot of volatility in the market.
Okay, so higher prices, what else? What other ripple effects are we seeing?
Well, the second major consequence is a drop in overall international trade. Makes sense, right? When tariffs make goods more expensive to trade across borders, the demand naturally decreases. So that leads to a slowdown in the global movement of goods and services. We saw a logistics report from February of this year that pointed to slower shipping volumes on major international routes, and that's directly tied to these increased trade tensions.
Yeah, that's a logical outcome. I guess if something's suddenly more expensive because of tariffs, people and businesses are going to buy less of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's two big ones, higher prices, less trade. But how do companies themselves deal with this kind of disruption? I mean, their whole business models are often built around global supply chains.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. You see, a lot of companies have built these really intricate networks of suppliers and manufacturers all over the world to try to maximize efficiency and keep costs down. But when tariffs come into play, it throws a wrench into those systems. It forces companies to scramble to find new suppliers or new manufacturing options, which are often more expensive or less efficient. And that can lead to production delays, getting things to market slower, and it just generally raises operational costs for everyone.
Ugh, that sounds like a logistical nightmare for companies trying to keep their production on track and manage their budgets. I bet all this uncertainty also has a chilling effect on hiring and expansion plans, right?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. When businesses face this kind of unpredictable trade environment, they tend to get really hesitant about investing in the future. They might freeze hiring or even cut jobs as they try to figure out how to navigate the situation. And any plans for expansion or new ventures are likely to be put on hold until things settle down a bit.
Okay, so we have businesses basically stuck in limbo, consumers paying more trade, slowing down. It all adds up to a pretty uncertain economic outlook. What about investors? how they typically react to this kind of global instability.
Well, investors tend to get a lot more cautious during times of trade friction. That's pretty predictable.
Yeah, makes sense.
When there's this much uncertainty in the global markets, they tend to shy away from riskier investments, and that can lead to a slowdown in overall investment activity, which just further dampens economic growth. In fact, one market analysis you sent over actually highlighted a correlation between announcements of escalating tariffs and dips in global stock markets.
So it creates a kind of a domino effect.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing impacts another, and it all feeds into this broader slowdown of the global economy.
Right, you've got it. Higher prices, reduced trade, disrupted supply chains, hiring freezes, nervous investors. All of these factors contribute to a slower pace of global economic growth. And unfortunately, we're seeing some very real examples of this playing out right now in 2025.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. What are some of the trade actions happening right now that illustrate these points?
Well, big development recently has been the United States reinstating tariffs on a range of Chinese goods, particularly in sectors like electronics, electric vehicles, and solar panels. It's a major escalation, and of course, China is already planning retaliatory measures targeting key U.S. exports. It's that classic tit-for-tat dynamic we talked about earlier playing out in real time.
So the economic battle lines are being redrawn as we speak. And it's not just the U.S. and China involved, is it?
No, it's not. The European Union is also taking a hard look at its trade relationships, and they're seriously considering new tariffs on imports from Asia.
Wow.
This seems to be driven by concerns about trade imbalances and a desire to protect their own industries, and it suggests that this trend towards protectionist measures is becoming more widespread globally.
Not a good sign, is it? All this points to a pretty worrying picture of rising global trade friction. What are the major international economic bodies saying about the potential impact of all of this?
Well, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, has issued a pretty sobering forecast. They estimate that if these trade tensions keep escalating at the current rate, global trade growth could fall below 1% in 2025.
Wow, that's not good.
No, not at all. To put that in perspective, a growth rate that low signals a real drag on the global economy and raises concerns about potential stagnation.
So it's pretty clear that the countries directly involved in these trade wars are facing some serious headwinds. But what about countries like India that aren't initiating these tariffs? How are they getting caught in this global economic crossfire?
India's involvement is mainly indirect, but the impact is still significant.
Okay, so.
One of the most immediate effects is on India's exports, especially to major markets like the US and Europe. As the global economy slows down because of these trade tensions, the overall demand for goods decreases, and that naturally impacts how much India can sell abroad.
Right, makes sense.
And we saw a report from an Indian Trade Promotion Council just recently that showed a dip in export orders in the first quarter of 2025. So even if Indian products are still competitive in terms of price and quality, if the overall demand in places like the US and Europe shrinks, India's export sales will inevitably take a hit.
Yeah, okay, but that makes sense. On top of that, a lot of Indian businesses, particularly in manufacturing, rely on imported machinery components, raw materials, and a good chunk of that often comes from China.
That's right. And that's where the second major impact comes in. You see, if these trade wars lead to tariffs that make those crucial imports more expensive or harder to get, it directly drives up the costs for Indian manufacturers.
Oh, I see. So it's a double whammy. Reduced demand for exports and rising costs for imports.
Exactly. And all of this puts a squeeze on Indian businesses, especially the smaller ones. You know, the micro, small, and medium enterprises, the MSMEs. Their profit margins are often already pretty thin, and this kind of pressure can really hurt them. And ultimately, those increased production costs can also trickle down to consumers within India as companies have to raise prices to stay afloat.
So it ends up contributing to inflation in India as well.
Right. It creates a ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
So we're seeing a slowdown in exports, higher import costs, inflationary pressure, and it sounds like all of this is particularly tough on certain sectors within India.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some key sectors that are really feeling the heat right now.
Which ones?
Well, based on the research we've seen, the garments industry, auto parts manufacturers, exporters of engineering goods, and even the IT services sector are all facing challenges. Reports are showing fewer new orders from international clients, tighter pricing, and in some cases, even delays in getting paid for completed work. You know, there was an article in a financial publication just last month that highlighted growing concerns within the Indian IT sector about project cancellations and budget cuts from clients in the US and Europe.
Oof, that doesn't sound good. It sounds like a real strain on some vital parts of the Indian economy. And it's not just about the trade of physical goods and services, right? What about investment into India? Is that being affected by all this global uncertainty as well?
Yeah, that's another crucial point. Investors don't like uncertainty, and all these trade wars are creating a lot of it globally. So we're seeing foreign investors becoming much more cautious about putting their money into India. Especially after what was already a tough year for investment in 2024, there's been a noticeable slowdown in foreign direct investment, or FDI, and also in the startup funding landscape.
Right, makes sense. Investors want stability and predictability, and trade wars throw all of that out the window.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a bit of a domino effect, isn't it? Trade tensions in other parts of the world create these ripple effects that impact India's trade performance and its ability to attract the investment it needs for growth.
You've got it.
But amidst all this gloom and doom, is there any potential upside for India? Any glimmer of hope or a long-term opportunity that might emerge from all of this?
Well, there is one potential long-term benefit that some analysts are pointing to.
Okay, tell me more.
You see, as multinational companies look for ways to diversify their supply chains and reduce their reliance on countries that are directly caught up in these trade wars, India could become a more attractive destination for them. The idea is that companies might choose to set up manufacturing or sourcing operations in India as a way to get around the risks associated with tariffs and trade uncertainties elsewhere.
Oh, interesting. So India could benefit from companies looking for a safe haven from the trade war storm.
That's the theory, at least.
But that kind of shift would take time, wouldn't it? It wouldn't really address the immediate challenges Indian businesses are facing right now.
Absolutely. This is very much a long-term possibility.
So what can be done in the short term? What can India do to weather this current storm?
Well, a lot of the research we've looked at emphasizes the need for proactive government policies. Things like providing export incentives to help Indian businesses stay competitive globally and offering strong support for domestic manufacturing to reduce reliance on those imports that might be subject to disruptions or price hikes because of the trade wars.
So kind of a two-pronged approach.
Hmm.
Supporting exports to keep them strong and boosting domestic production to reduce dependence on those risky imports.
Exactly. And there's another interesting angle that some of the analysis suggests.
Okay, what's that?
It might actually be strategically advantageous for India to stay out of these major global trade conflicts, not to get directly involved in the tariff battles. That could potentially position India as a more stable and neutral trading partner in the long run.
Hmm, that's an interesting thought. So for everyone listening, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways from this deep dive into trade wars and how India fits into the picture.
That's good.
First of all, it's important to understand that a trade war isn't just about tariffs. It sets off this whole chain reaction of retaliatory measures, and it ends up having negative consequences for everyone involved, directly or indirectly.
Absolutely.
And those negative consequences are pretty serious. We're talking about a slowdown in global trade, higher prices for consumers, disrupted supply chains, and just this general climate of economic uncertainty that can stifle job creation and investment.
Right. It really throws a wrench into the whole system.
And even though India isn't directly involved in imposing these tariffs, it's still feeling the effects through weaker demand for its exports, higher costs for essential imports, and more hesitant foreign investors.
Yeah, India is very much part of this interconnected global economy, so it's inevitably affected by these trade wars.
And it doesn't sound like this is a temporary blip on the radar. These trade tensions between major economies are still ongoing in 2025, and they seem to be escalating.
Yeah, that's the reality of the situation right now. These trade wars that are being initiated by the big economic powers have far-reaching consequences that go way beyond their own borders. They impact various industries and ultimately the lives of individuals in ways that might not be immediately obvious.
This has been a really eye-opening look at a complex issue that's becoming more and more relevant all the time. It's clear that these trade wars have some pretty significant implications for the whole global economic system.
Yeah, it really highlights how interconnected we all are in the 21st century. What one major player does can create ripple effects that are felt across the globe.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has been a really valuable deep dive into a topic that we hear a lot about, but don't always get to explore in this much depth.
My pleasure. I hope this has helped to shed some light on the complexities of trade wars and how India is navigating this challenging global landscape.
And for all of you listening, we hope this has given you some food for thought. It's crucial to understand how interconnected the global economy really is, and how these trade disputes can have real, tangible effects on businesses and people even in countries that aren't directly involved in imposing tariffs.
It raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? Are these trade wars, which are often presented as a way to protect domestic industries, really an effective strategy in the long run? Or do the widespread economic costs ultimately outweigh any perceived benefits to national growth and prosperity? These are crucial questions to consider as these global trade dynamics continue to unfold.
Lots to think about for sure. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, keep diving deeper into the issues that matter.